Welcome to the last podcast for 4849, and hopefully shortest, where we really talk about chapter 49, which will be the brain. We're not going to go over everything about the brain, but I want to at least go through some of the basics. So over here you can see that there's a diagram, and it's broken into 6 chunks. These 3 off to the right will be considered the hindbrain. So when you look at that, those 3 parts will be at the base, because as you look at the picture here, you're talking the base of the brain is pretty much the left, and at the right you're talking about the more elaborate parts. So you can see you've got the medulla, you've got the pons, and you have the cerebellum, and in the human brains you have the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. So these are going to vary in size though. You can tell in the shark it's actually a huge portion of the brain. You're probably talking like 40% of it or so, whereas in the human you're probably talking more like 10 or 15% of the total brain. Then you've got the mesencephalon, or the midbrain is what that's usually referred to. The midbrain plus the hindbrain are commonly called the brainstem as well. So sometimes this will be kind of grouped with these other 3. And that'll be in green, so you can see once again that's decent sized within the shark. Within humans, not so much. I mean, it's still part of that relatively small percent that's with the brain, well, the hindbrain, comprising the brainstem of humans. And then lastly, you've got the diencephalon and the telencephalon, which are commonly referred to as the forebrain within humans at least, but even with more primitive stuff, it's called the forebrain. And you can see the forebrain is actually not very big. The diencephalon's pretty small, and then the telencephalon in the shark is also fairly small. So it's by no means the majority of the shark brain. Whereas in humans, this telencephalon especially is the majority of our brain. The diencephalon's not tiny, but it's certainly not huge. But the telencephalon is most of our brain. And so this kind of separates human brains and human ability to process information from most other animals, especially relatively primitive animals like fish or reptiles, because we have such a large telencephalon. And you'll see later we're going to go through the basics of what each does as to why that might allow us to be unique compared to many animals. So starting with the brainstem, we said that's the hindbrain plus the midbrain. Now the hindbrain, what you might consider the most primitive part of things, will be focused on homeostatic functions. So regulating a lot of stuff. It could be control of things like our blood sugar, breathing, heart rate. This is helping keep us alive. You'll see other critical functions like arousal, you have to be able to reproduce, sleep, which will control via the hormone melatonin. Coordination, that's essential if you're going to be a predator or prey. You have to be able to move appropriately so you can catch something or avoid it. And so these will all be the kind of survival hindbrain things. The midbrain's mostly associated with inputs, where audiovisual stuff, there's things called colliculi, and it's basically just where the information are brought in from our eyes and ears so that they can go elsewhere if needed to be processed. So these are all critical functions just to live, just to be able to get by. We're not talking about calculus here, we're just talking about survival. Now with the diencephalon, we've moved into the forebrain, but this is the older, more base part, and I mean base is in like lower physically within the brain part. This is normally just above the brainstem that we have within organisms. And so it technically has 3 parts, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the epithalamus. But I'm going to focus on the hypothalamus and thalamus because those are the ones that I feel like focusing on. And so you'll see the thalamus is going to control a lot of the other sensory inputs beyond just audio and visual. You'll see the hypothalamus does a lot of regulation, so circadian rhythm, the biological clock, is taken care of by this, as well as other homeostatic functions. We've talked about temperature, thirst and hunger, some more of these basic things that you have to keep alive. That's why we consider this the primitive forebrain. Yes, it's part of the forebrain, but it's still serving a function that's much like that of the brainstem. That's why you see this appears to be very old, it's been around a long time, and it's tucked in there right with the brainstem. This is just keeping you alive, and it does that by typically detecting stimuli and various other sensory inputs, and then it can convert those to the appropriate response, which is usually like acting on the pituitary to make it release hormones to make sure that homeostasis is maintained. And so if you look in like 45 in the book, we didn't go crazy with this, but you'll see that there's a lot of control by things like the hypothalamus that act upon other glands like the pituitary gland to make it release a bunch of hormones that can then go out through your body and cause various changes in your body, whether it's excreting more water and urine or less, whether it's, altering something to do with your ratio of blood sugar production, so you can do fight or flight. All kinds of different stuff can be controlled by this, but that's the type of functions it's doing. I'm keeping you alive, I'm keeping you regulated, I'm keeping you balanced. Now the telencephalon is where things really shine. This is going to be the bulk of our brain, but this is going to be the parts where we do most of the thinking and processing that we think of as making us human. So especially the cerebrum, which is going to be that large chunk kind of right here that looks like sausage, but it's a really large portion at the front part, if you will, and the top part of your head. And that's where things like memory and learning occur. That's where emotion occurs, the stuff that we think of as being humanity, as we think of as allowing for civilization, allowing us to be different. You'll also see if you go further back, so kind of more towards the back of your head, but towards the top, we've got the cerebral cortex, where you have a bunch of sensory information comes to get processed, and then it can be sent out to cause the motor response. So I can send the nerves based on what I'm kind of getting in, what I'm hearing, what I'm detecting. I can send out messages then to modify my physical behavior. By firing effector cells like muscle cells or various glands, you can cause responses. That's going to be done by the cerebral cortex. And then lastly, our brain is kind of in two parts. All right, we've got a left and a right hemisphere. And a lot of the signals that we detect on the right side of our body actually go up and kind of cross over into the left, and a lot of the stuff on the left side of the body crosses over the right. And it can do that because there is a connecting piece, a connecting highway of nervous tissue called the corpus callosum. And so this allows for signals to go from one side of the brain to the other, because elsewise your brain is actually separated. You know, it's not intricately connected outside of this corpus callosum, at least not your forebrain, not this telencephalon. And so this is a critical piece, and if it gets separated, then your brain no longer can communicate between the two sides, which in some cases they will do. I believe in certain cases of like epilepsy, they'll try to block this, is my understanding of things, which can impact some of your abilities because you can't send the signals back and forth. But I believe in some cases it will actually stop the epilepsy.